So now that we're getting into the actual devices themselves, we're going to have to go in there and manage them. So remember I was talking about managed switches or the modular switches where they have a management card. The routers as well, they have management access necessary. If you get into the ASA firewalls or any of the other Cisco products, you need to get in there and configure it somehow. So in order to configure it, first you need to be running an operating system. And Cisco's operating system is called the Internetwork Operating System. That's iOS. So whenever I refer to the iOS file or the bin file, that's the iOS, that's what it is. The Internetwork Operating System, that is your operating system for the device. Everything needs to run some sort of version of iOS. Even if they purchase, on occasion Cisco will purchase other companies' technology and products, and over time they'll actually get them to start running iOS, and they'll have a version of iOS for that. So everything's becoming consolidated under one operating system, or at least one command set. So they're all starting to centralize and simplify. The iOS file is stored in Flash, which is actually a CF card, a compact flash card. If you look on a lot of Cisco devices, there'll be a slot that has some sort of card that's already in there. You can actually remove that and upgrade it in size. It's non-volatile. It's NVRAM. It's non-volatile RAM, and you can, so that way you can store the iOS file on there. You can store other non-volatile items that you want to store on there, like your VLAN file, your graphical interface. If you want to set up ASDM on it or something like that, you'll include other files on that flash card. So on occasion you may have to upgrade that in size based on what you want to store on it. One boot, it's loaded into RAM. That way the system has it loaded up, and when you look at a device boot from the console, especially when you look at it in GNS or in Packet Tracer, you'll see a series of pound signs as it boots. If you're looking in the beginning, it'll keep showing pound signs. That's it extracting the iOS file and loading it into RAM. So in order to configure this iOS, we need to connect to it somehow. So on initial boot, we don't have any IP address information assigned to it. We don't have any sort of management configuration done whatsoever. We need to go in through the console. So remember I was talking about that rollover cable? That's what we need. We need that rollover cable. And you'll connect it into that blue console port in the back of your Cisco device. In the console connection on our PC that we're going to use to connect into it, we're going to need to configure it a certain way. So in order to do that, we need to have a certain speed set. So that's 9600 bits per second. We need to set it to 8 data bits. You're going to have none for your parity. You're going to have 1 stop bit. And none for flow control. So these are the settings you're going to use to connect with your serial emulation program. If you're on a laptop, you're probably not going to have a serial connection, so that blue rollover cable that they provide goes from an RJ45 connection to a serial connection, and you're going to have a problem. So there's adapters out there that you can purchase that'll go from USB to serial, and then it'll show up as like COM3 or COM4 on your laptop. That's something you're going to need, and then you can plug in that rollover cable. Or if you're on an older PC, you may actually have a serial connection in the back. A lot of newer ones now are starting to ditch that, so just know that you need that, or you need to get an adapter. So once you get it plugged in, you'll have to actually set up your console serial connection. So if you're using PuTTY or Kitty or any of the other ones out there, HyperTerminal, if you're using an older version of Windows, they included one called HyperTerminal. You'll set up what COM port is being used on your computer, And then here's the settings we were talking about: 9600 bits, 8 data bits, 1 stop bit, no parity, and no flow control. If you set it up that way, you'll be able to connect through the console connection to your Cisco device. If you're using GNS or Packet Tracer, it'll automatically do that for you, so you don't have to really worry about that. Once we get IP information on it, we can connect to it over Telnet if we configure that. We can connect to it over SSH if we configure that, which is our preferred method. Or we could potentially connect over an aux port, which is kind of like a console, but over a modem. It's an older method of connecting. So let's go into GNS and take a look at the device, and we'll go into some of the things that a basic system has. Okay, I'm just going to check my iOS images. Alright, I have a 3700 in here. I'm going to drop that in, and then we'll start that up. Now we'll watch the console boot up. See those pound signs? That's it extracting the iOS file and loading it into RAM. And then we can watch the boot process. And with it being emulated, it's actually pretty quick. So now we're already up and in. Let me see if it'll let me. Good. Okay. So we are already in a privileged mode. One of the basic modes that it will connect you into if you if you don't go in through console once we set it up, if you go in through a non-trusted method such as Telnet or SSH or something, you'll get a different prompt. And what the prompt will look like is it'll look like this. It'll say, router name, that's your host name there. You can name it whatever you want, and then it'll say that. It'll have a different symbol. So this means that you're in a non-privileged mode. You're in a user executive mode. When you have that pound symbol, that's kind of the global definition of you're in some sort of executive mode. If you're in Linux, if you're in some sort of Linux computer and you have a pound, that means you're root. So root is the administrator. Similar idea here. If you have pound, that means you're the administrator. You're in a privileged mode. So this is privileged exec. So make sure you know what mode you're in. Are you in user mode or privileged mode? That's a big difference. You cannot do configurations from unless you're in privileged mode. So luckily we're already in there. We'll go back to our GNS. When you're in the user-only mode, you can only do show commands. And what you can do is type show and type question mark. See how I did that? If you type question mark, it'll automatically show you all the commands that you can do, which is pretty handy. If you press space, it'll continue with another page of information. If you press enter, it'll do one line at a time. If I push Q, it'll quit out of that. I can also press question mark all the way at the basic level, and it'll show me all the commands that are available to me. And again, I can do space bar or enter or Q. If I want to go and get into this mode that I'm in privileged exec mode. If I want to go down to a less privileged mode, I would type disable. So I'm already in privileged exec. I want to go into user exec mode. I can type disable, and now it's showing that prompt. So if I do a question mark here, you'll see I have less commands available to me, a lot less. So most of these they're pretty harmless. You can't really change any settings on the system. you pretty much can just show a whole bunch of things, which is useful for basic diagnostics. But if you have a lower level tier 1 support person, you could give them user exec mode instead of privileged exec, and they could be, they could take a look and try and diagnose some things without actually breaking anything. If you want to go from user to privileged, it's basically the same idea, but you're going to type enable. In the Cisco iOS, you can also do shorthand. As long as it's unique and it matches the command, it'll figure out the rest of it. If you don't type the entire command that's not disambiguous, it'll yell at you. So I typed dis. If I type dis question mark, you'll see that there's 2 commands that are available, disconnect or disable. So if I just type dis enter, it's going to say, well, which one do you want? If I type disa for disable, it'll figure out the rest of the command. So often when you're doing configurations, and you'll probably see me do it later on, you're going to start shorthanding a lot of things. And from my experience, you can do that on the exam as well. They have an interactive portion, and you can shorthand yourself through that. And it also supports question mark. One of the other things you can do also, let's do enable, and we'll type dis and tab. If it's unique, it will automatically fill in that. If it's not unique, if it's ambiguous, it will just keep doing this. So if I type disa and press tab, now it fills in the rest of the word. If I type en and press tab, it fills in the rest of the word. If I type e and press tab, that's ambiguous. So you can actually use this to your advantage to fill in the rest of commands you might not remember. So, oh yeah, enable, okay. Oh, I want to do show and question mark. We're going to do show backhaul expressions. Show back. Do a question. Oh, okay. Backhaul. Tab. Oh, okay, yeah, there's that command. So you can use tab and question mark to help you figure out the commands you want to type. Because you might remember the general idea as to what you want to get done, but you might remember the exact command. So you don't forget to use tab and question mark to your advantage. They're very helpful. So question mark, space, enter, Q, tab complete, question mark, and so on. Also, if you notice there, I typed to disable question mark. So it tells me what privilege level I could go to. I could actually drop down to not just the basic privilege level, but I could change privilege levels, which is something you can do. You can provide different administrators different levels of privilege. The lowest being 0, the highest being 15. So when I'm in the mode I am in now, I'm in privilege level 15. When I'm back to the user exec mode, I'm in privilege level 0. And then you could have anything in between there as well. So in large environments, you might have different administrators in different levels of privileged mode. The CR means you can do carriage return, as in enter, to complete the command. So when you see CR, that means you can either provide optional information or you can complete that command with a carriage return. That's what that means. So now that we're in user mode, let's go back up to privileged mode. And I can do some things like show. You saw some of those, like show, and then a whole list of them. One of the common ones we can do is show running config. So notice how I typed show run with 2 N's and then did a tab. It's pretty handy, right? If I do show running config, it'll show the configuration that's currently running. Makes sense, right? And I'll press space and it'll show me more, and it'll show me more of what's going on in this router. So what that means is there are 2 configurations on a Cisco device. There's the running configuration that's in RAM, and then there's the startup configuration that's in NVRAM, non-volatile RAM. The startup configuration could be potentially different, and actually take a look at that. Show running config. Here's a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. The exclamation points just mean empty line. And show startup is actually a lot smaller. So the startup config is the saved version, and the running config is the currently being worked on version. whenever you make changes that you want to keep, make sure you save your config. And I'll show you how to do that. Whenever you make changes and you don't want to save your config, you can just trash the running config or just reload the device, and it'll just come up with the startup config, and then you're back to where you were. In order to save it, we can do copy running config startup config, and it'll say, are you sure? Is this the name you want? You say yes, you push enter, and it'll do that. So now if we do show startup config, oh look, here's all that configuration. Now it overwrote the startup config. There's also an older command that's been around called write, or WR. You'll probably see me use that quite a bit. I've heard it's going away, but it not yet, so it might be bad form for me to show you this, but whatever. If you type WR, it basically does a copy running config startup config without typing it all out. So that's why a lot of us like to use it. You can also do this. So remember I said it'll guess the rest of the command. So we can do copy run start, and it guesses the rest of those file names. So it automatically figured out I meant copy running -config startup -config. So you can really make your life easier with typing by just using pieces of the commands. That's why they look kind of cryptic sometimes when you look online. And you look at examples that people write out, sometimes they look all sorts of kind of crazy, and you'll get used to it. You'll get used to the crazy. And that's just shorthand because the system figures out the rest. And we don't want, we're IT, we don't want to necessarily, type out every single command. We like to try and shorten our things and make our lives easier. So that's our way of doing that. We can also erase certain things. So remember I mentioned you could wipe out certain configs in that. You can do that with erase. So I could erase my startup config, for example, or I could erase a file system. You can also delete certain things. So not just erase the whole file system or erase the startup config, but I can also delete items out of my flash. So for example, I could do delete flash and then specify a file, but I'd have to see what's in my flash first. So let's take a look at my flash. I have nothing there. So if I stored a file in my flash, I could delete it. Or when you could use the erase command to erase a config file or erase a file system completely. So those are some other useful commands you could use. In order to configure the device, you're going to want to go into configure mode. And then you're going to specify where am I configuring this from. I'm configuring this from the terminal. You can also shorten that by doing config T, which is probably what you'll see most often in different documents out there. In order to get out of config mode, you're going to type exit, and that will get you back. It'll take you down one level. And I'll show you something else as well in a second, but we can type config T, and it will figure out we meant configure terminal. It gets us into configure mode. Here is where we can actually do all of these configurations. We can give it an IP address, we can set up AAA, we can change the boot iOS file, we can change the clock and the host name, and do all sorts of fun things. We'll go over a lot of these items. Host name, all sorts of things. So these are all the things we can configure. If we go up one level, think of this as like a hierarchy. So we have our user mode, and then above that we have our privileged exec mode, and then above that we have our config mode. And then in config there's a bunch of different branches. So that's all these commands you see here. Inside each of these branches are additional config modes you could have. So it's kind of like a constantly branching system of configure that you could do. So let's go into interface, and then we have to choose an interface. So what kind of interface are we talking about? I believe this has a fast Ethernet something. So I just did a 0/0. We'll talk more about what that means. But now I'm in config-if right now. That means I'm in configure mode and I'm in the interface configuration mode. And if I look in here, there's actually different commands from what were shown before. So now I have different commands that are specific to the interface. So notice how there's a speed command and there's like a duplex command and stuff like that. These are things that are only for this interface. So in order to get out of the interface config, I would type exit, and that'll take me back to regular config mode. If I go back to the interface, I can also type end, and if I type end, that'll take me all the way back to exec mode, privileged exec mode. So that's a nice way that if you get real deep into some hierarchy and you just want to go back to plain old privileged exec mode, you can just type end and it'll get you all the way back to start. But sometimes it's useful to just get yourself back one level, which is where exit comes in. Some other things we can do. Is, as you saw there, I did int FA01, so that's shorthand again. Instead of typing interface fast Ethernet 0/1, I could just type int FA01. That's a really easy way of just going boom right into the interface you want. You'll see me type that all the time, as well as online. All the internet docs out there will probably say things like that, int FA01 or int G101, etc., etc. So another thing you can do when you're in here is not just the tab and the question mark and things like that, but you can do the up arrow and the down arrow, which show you your last commands. This is a very handy thing when you are trying to doing something repetitive, or you need to go back to some crazy command you typed and you don't remember what it was and it was very long, and so you just go, tap up a couple times and find out what you wanted, and then there you go. Now you're back to that command you used. That's very handy to use as well. Some other things we can do in the interface, for example, we can set descriptions, and we'll get more into this, but we can set IP addresses with IP address, and you can just keep tabbing your way through this until you get the command you want. And you can define an address and say, okay, this is 1.200, and then do a question mark again after a space, and it'll say, oh, what's your subnet mask? Oh, here we go. Do a question mark again. At this point, see how it says CR? I can just push enter, and now I have that IP address assigned to that interface. I can also set a description. I can say description, this is Verizon Telecom. Now when I go in and I look at that interface, I do a show interface on that interface, it'll then tell me, oh yeah, that's Verizon Telecom. So that's some information that can help me in the future when I need to diagnose this. So speaking of show interface, let's show that. If I do show interface, here we go. If I do show interface, it doesn't work. Andrew, what is going on? You can't do show commands from within configure mode. So that's where that exit and those end commands come in handy. You need to get out of config mode to do that. Or you can type do show interface, etc., etc. But now I can't do question mark or tab complete. So you have to know exactly what you want. So sometimes you might be deep in some sort of hierarchy of configuration and you need to do a little show command to make sure that what you configured is correct, but you don't want to get out of it. You'll have to know the entire command to do that. Or you can just type end at this point and say, alright, get me out of config. Now we can do show interface and tab it out. And if I show the interfaces, okay, well there's my interface, and here's our description, and then here's the IP address I gave it. So you can see how that works. I already showed you show running config and show startup config. What else can we show? We can show show IP interface brief. Show IP interface brief. This is a great command. When you have a device that has 48 ports on it, like a switch coming up that we're going to be doing, or a router with a whole bunch of different crazy interfaces, show interface brief is probably the most commonly used and useful command you can possibly use. We have our interface, we have our IP address, we have is it up or down, is it manually set, was it dynamically configured, is it administratively down, is it up, is the protocol working on it or not, is it up or down. It's very handy. You can also shorthand it, of course, so show IP int brief and that'll do the same thing. So one thing you notice there, see how it says administratively down? And you say, well, okay, well, it's down. What does administratively down mean? Well, that means I didn't turn the interface on. So even though I don't have anything connected to this right now, but that's okay. What we're going to do is go in there, conf t, int fa00, and I need to tell it to turn this interface on. In order to do that, Cisco iOS likes to make you use negatives. So in order to do that, you have to say no. So no turns something off. And in this situation, all of the interfaces are by default turned off. So what we have to do is tell it to don't turn it off, as in turn it on. So it's like a double negative. So no shutdown or no shut, we'll tell it to turn that interface on. And since we're on the console, it'll actually tell us that. If you're connected with Telnet or SSH, unless you tell it to send these commands to you, this informational message stuff, it won't show it to you unless you're on the console. So here it'll show and say, oh yeah, I turned on the interface, the state has changed to up, and let's go take a look. We'll go back to end, and actually, you know what? We'll do this. We'll do show IP int brief. I know the command now. So now I'm still in config mode, but I just did a show command. So there's an example of using the do command to do that. And I now have my interface turned on. So that's pretty handy. What happens if I add another router? We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that's okay. We'll start this one. And let's connect it. So we're going to go from 0, 0, 0, 0. And look at that. So now that I've turned the interface on and I've connected it, it shows up as green. That's pretty nice. Let's go into the interface and we'll turn it off. Shutdown. Whoops. Also, you can't use the home or end commands. You can't when you're doing this. You just saw that these weird characters show up. If you press home or end to try and jump back and forth on a line, like you might in a normal shell on an operating system, it doesn't like that. So you have to use the left and right arrows to kind of go back and forth to get to where you want. I forgot to do the do. So that's what I was trying to do there. So now it shows administratively down. So we can just do no shut again, and then it'll turn back on. And then we'll probably get a message in a second here. There we go. So that's one way of doing it. What I was looking for back here was it should have turned this as red. Not sure why GNS is doing that, but that's okay. If you try this in Packet Tracer, it should have shown as red then, and that'll show as down. That might have something to do with the built-in interfaces on whatever model it's emulating. So no big deal. One other thing we can do is we'll go back to end. We're back in privileged exec mode. Let's show our version. Show version or show ver. This will show all sorts of interesting information about this router. So what kind of series is it? What's the model? What iOS is currently loaded on it? So this has got this iOS loaded on it. What version is it? Let's see, what else information? It'll also show us some information about some boot information. It'll also show you some data about what virtual switches. There we go, the configuration register. One thing you can do if you forget your enable password. So right now I've been doing this. I've been doing disable, enable, and it just automatically drops me into the administrator privileged exec mode. You're going to want to password that because you don't want anyone getting in there and just saying enable, and then they can go and do whatever they want. If you forget that password that you end up setting, which we'll go into in the next video, is you can actually kind of do like a password recovery on the system by using a specific configuration register. And the configuration register is like flipping some switches on the board. So it's a virtual method of bypassing some jumpers on the board. And if anyone is older out there and remembers the old motherboards where if you installed a certain processor, you had to put in certain jumpers to tell the motherboard what kind of processor you installed, and That's the basic idea here. Is it's a virtual jumper. So you can set the virtual jumper, the configuration register, to a certain value, and that'll tell you what value you're on. So that way you know if it's in normal mode or if it's in password recovery mode, it'll show you there. It also tells you some information about your NVRAM, what CPU you've got, basic hardware information. So it's very useful to take a look and see, what version am I on, what iOS is loaded, do I need to upgrade this or not, things like that. So at this point we'll stop here. I've gone over some of the basics of how to navigate the iOS, and we'll go into some command basics next and configuration and things like that.